The air in Leflore County still tastes of iron and smoke, even after nearly 2 centuries. Locals say it's just the swamp's old roots bleeding into the water, but those who've walked past the crooked gate of the Belrose Plantation know better. They say the soil remembers. Every gust of wind carries whispers, and every creaking branch sounds like a voice calling from beneath the earth. Most won't go near that place after sundown, not since the night they say the ground itself breathed. When the stranger arrived that autumn, the town went silent. He came with a notebook, a photograph, and too many questions about a scandal no one dared to mention. The story he sought belonged to a family that had vanished in 1843, leaving behind a legacy so foul that even the church refused to speak their name. The plantation owner, his wife, and their 2 sons had built an empire of cotton and blood, but beneath the genteel facade lay something far darker. They hadn't just owned their slaves, they had bred them. At first, it was said to be for labor to create stronger stock. But as years passed, the lines blurred. The owner's sons took their father's methods further, and the wife herself became part of the twisted arrangement. No one knew where the family ended and the enslaved began. Children were born who shared both the master's face and his chains, and those who lived long enough to grow up learned to hide their resemblance. When the war came, the plantation burned, but not all the screams were from fire. Now, the old house sits swallowed by vines, its chimneys jutting from the earth like tombstones. The stranger thinks he's chasing history, but the thing waiting in those woods is not history, it's blood. It watches from the shadows, breathing through the cracks of time, waiting for its name to be spoken again. And once it is, the soil of Belrose Plantation will stir, remembering every child born of sin and silence beneath its cursed roof. The stranger arrived in Leflore County under the pretense of research, carrying nothing but a worn leather satchel, a journal, and a camera older than himself. He said he was a writer from the north, drawn by whispers of an untold story buried somewhere in the decaying heart of Mississippi. To the townsfolk, he was a curiosity at first, polite, soft-spoken, asking questions that no one had dared to ask in generations. But as his inquiries grew more specific, their eyes began to harden. The name he uttered, *Belrose Plantation*, was one that turned the air cold wherever it was spoken. Even the sheriff, an old man with cloudy eyes and a voice like gravel, warned him to stay clear of the woods east of the river. He called it God's forgotten place, a patch of land where compasses spun wild and dogs refused to bark. The stranger didn't heed the warnings. He had read too much, seen too many hints scattered across dusty archives, to believe it was just a tale. Old letters from 1843 mentioned disappearances, a fire that consumed the estate, and a mysterious family whose wealth was whispered to have come not from cotton alone, but from something far darker. The deeper he dug, the more he found inconsistencies, birth records with missing names, ledgers that ended abruptly, property deeds written in identical handwriting across 3 generations. Something was wrong, something deliberate, and it was all tied to that stretch of woods the locals refused to name aloud. He took lodging in a rundown inn on the edge of town, where the floorboards moaned with every step and the walls carried the smell of mildew and dust. The innkeeper, a woman well into her 80s, served him tea without ever meeting his eyes. That night, as he pored over his notes, she appeared at his door holding a faded map. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it, her voice a whisper as she said, "If you're looking for what they left behind, don't go after dark." Then she left before he could ask more. The next morning, he followed the map into the woods, tracing the path of an overgrown trail where sunlight barely touched the ground. The silence there was unnatural, too thick, too still. Branches seemed to bend away from him as he walked, and every few steps he felt the soft crunch of something underfoot, like brittle bones buried shallow. He found no plantation, no ruins, just the faint outline of a gate swallowed by vines. Hanging from it was a rusted plaque, barely legible beneath years of decay, bearing a single name etched in iron, *Belrose Star. The discovery came 2 days after the stranger's arrival, in the most unexpected of places. The old courthouse stood at the center of town, its white columns streaked with the rust of rain and neglect. It had been abandoned for decades, ever since the new building went up near the highway, but the stranger had a habit of prying into forgotten corners. He slipped through the warped doors one humid afternoon, the air inside thick with the scent of mold and paper long dead. Dust floated in the sunlight like ash, settling on rows of broken benches and shattered glass. He moved slowly, his footsteps echoing across the emptiness, searching for anything that might connect to the Belrose name. What he found instead was a floorboard that didn't sound quite right. One hollow thump, distinct from the others. He crouched down, pried it open, and there, wrapped in the remnants of a rotted burlap sack, lay a book that seemed half alive with decay. The ledger was heavy, bound in cracked leather that peeled beneath his fingertips. Its edges were burnt, as if someone had tried to destroy it long ago. Inside, the pages were yellowed and fragile, written in slanted cursive that spoke of another time. At first, it appeared to be a list of names, followed by strange notations, dates, numbers, symbols he couldn't decipher. But then he realized what he was looking at. Each name was followed by two others, one marked as property, the other as issue. The realization made his stomach tighten. These weren't just records of ownership. They were breeding logs. Schedules. An account of forced unions, catalogued like cattle, every entry marked with the initials of the plantation owner, T.B. Belrose. The deeper he read, the darker it became. Some of the entries listed women with no surnames, only ages, while others referenced sons of the house as participants. There were entire sections where the handwriting changed, shakier, desperate, as if written by someone else in secret. One note caught his attention, written in a trembling hand between the lines, * they make us bear their likeness. They call it purity. * The ink had bled from moisture, but the words were still legible enough to chill him. When he turned the final page, he found something else, a folded sheet tucked into the back cover, untouched by fire. It was a letter dated 1843, signed by the local sheriff of the time, warning that the abominations at Belrose must be erased before they reach the Lord's ears. The next day, the plantation had burned to the ground. Standing in that dim courthouse, with sunlight slanting across the burnt pages, the stranger realized the ledger wasn't just evidence of cruelty. It was a confession. And whoever had tried to destroy it hadn't succeeded completely. The first time the stranger heard the whispers was the night he returned from the courthouse, clutching the half-burned ledger like a curse he couldn't put down. He had walked the dirt road back toward the inn as the sun sank behind the tree line, painting the Mississippi sky in bruised shades of red and gold. The woods loomed on either side, dense and ancient, their canopies heavy with Spanish moss that swayed without wind. Every local had told him the same warning, don't wander near the trees after dark, but curiosity had always been his undoing. As twilight deepened, the air grew colder, unnaturally so for a southern night in August. The cicadas went silent. Even the frogs stopped calling. That's when he heard it, a faint murmur, like a breath caught between the leaves. At first, he thought it was the wind, but the rhythm was too deliberate, the cadence too human. It sounded like words, distorted and distant, carried through the branches as though the forest itself was speaking. He stopped walking, straining to listen, and the voice came clearer this time, a woman's, soft and trembling, repeating a name he couldn't quite make out. His pulse quickened. He shone his flashlight into the woods, the beam cutting through the mist that had begun to curl at the forest floor. The light caught on something pale, a handprint smeared against the bark of a tree, old and brittle, the size of a child's. Beneath it, etched crudely into the wood, were two letters, *B.B. He stepped closer, the whispering growing louder, overlapping now, a dozen voices all blending together. Some were weeping, some murmuring prayers, and others only gasping for air. The sound rose and fell with the wind, as if the trees were breathing in unison. He stumbled backward, his light shaking, catching glimpses of faces in the gaps between the trunks, translucent, fleeting, the shapes of people who weren't there. When he turned to run, the ledger slipped from his hands, pages fluttering open to the middle, where one sentence seemed to glow faintly in the beam of his light. They will never rest beneath the soil that bore them. By the time he reached the edge of town, his hands were trembling so badly he could barely unlock his door. The innkeeper found him hours later, sitting on the floor with the ledger open, whispering that the forest was alive. The townsfolk would later say he'd been touched by the voices that haunt the Belrose woods, the same voices of those who were bred, buried, and forgotten, but never forgiven by the land that still remembers their suffering. The next morning, when the stranger's fear had settled into a cold resolve, he returned to the woods to retrieve the ledger he had dropped. The mist still lingered between the trees, curling like ghostly fingers around the trunks, and every step felt heavier than the last. After an hour of searching, he found the book lying near the gate, damp but intact, the cover marked with a dark, oily stain that hadn't been there before. As he brushed the dirt away, his hand grazed against something half-buried beside it, a wooden frame, splintered and worn. He pulled it free and found himself staring at what had once been a painting. The canvas was torn, its colors faded, but the image beneath the grime was unmistakable. It was a family portrait. The faces stared back at him through the years, perfectly composed in that eerie, old-fashioned way. A man in a dark suit with eyes like polished stone, a woman in a white dress whose expression was too stiff to be serene, and beside them, two young boys, one smiling faintly, the other blank as marble. But there was something off about it, something deeply unsettling that made the stranger's breath catch. In the background of the painting, nearly hidden in shadow, were other figures, faces barely visible, their features blurred as though they had been painted over and scraped away. He could make out the faint outline of dark skin, the glint of a chain, and a child standing behind the family whose eyes mirrored the master's exactly. The longer he stared, the more the distinction between master and slave dissolved. He brought the portrait back to town, hoping to find someone who could identify it. The local historian, a retired teacher who had lived in Leflore all her life, turned pale the moment she saw it. She ran her fingers along the cracked paint and whispered that her grandmother once spoke of that very image, how it hung in the parlor of the Belrose mansion before the fire, a symbol of pride and power. But she said there was another version, one that had been hidden away, a corrected painting ordered after the scandal began, where certain faces were removed, replaced by shadows. The stranger realized that what he held was not just art but evidence, a visual record of the forbidden bloodline that the family had tried to erase. That night, as he examined it under the flicker of candlelight, the faint scent of smoke rose from the canvas. He could swear the faces had shifted, ever so slightly, their eyes no longer fixed on one another but staring directly at him. Days passed before the stranger found the courage to return to the plantation itself. Guided by the map the old innkeeper had given him and the unearthed portrait still burned into his mind, he ventured deeper into the woods until the trees opened up to reveal what remained of the Belrose mansion. Its once grand columns leaned at odd angles, its windows hollowed out, blackened by fire and time. The air was thick with the smell of rot and wet earth, and silence hung heavy around the ruins, broken only by the slow dripping of water through the fractured roof. It wasn't just an abandoned home, it felt like a wound that had never healed. As he stepped through the charred doorway, his light caught the remnants of a spiral staircase leading upward. Instinct drew him toward it, each step creaking beneath his boots like a groan from the house itself. On the second floor, he found a hallway lined with scorched wallpaper, its floral patterns barely visible beneath years of soot. Every door was sealed shut, nailed from the outside, except one. It was at the far end of the corridor, half collapsed, the hinges rusted. When he forced it open, a gust of cold air rushed out as though the room had been holding its breath. Inside, the smell changed, less of decay, more of something metallic, old and sour. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper of pale blue, and scattered across the floor were remnants of toys, a wooden horse, a doll missing an eye, a small carved figure painted in red. The sight should have been innocent, but the silence around those objects made them feel wrong, misplaced. Then he noticed the iron rings bolted into the walls. 6 of them, each spaced evenly apart, each attached to lengths of rusted chain. Beneath the dust, he could make out initials carved into the wooden boards, letters that matched names from the ledger. In the corner stood a chest, its lid warped and swollen from moisture. When he pried it open, he found a stack of old documents, family crests drawn in ink, each one marked with a symbol that blended the Belrose insignia with letters that appeared to be taken from the names of enslaved women. The meaning was clear, and it sickened him. The family hadn't merely blurred the line between bloodlines, they had recorded their own corruption as if it were legacy. As he backed away, the door slammed shut behind him, though there was no wind. His flashlight flickered, and in that moment of darkness, he swore he heard the rattle of chains from the walls, faint but rhythmic, like something remembering the weight it once held. The stranger was no longer welcome in town. Word had spread about his visits to the ruins and his questions that dug too deep into what everyone else had spent their lives trying to forget. Doors that once opened for him now stayed bolted, and conversations fell silent whenever he entered a room. Still, there was one person who didn't turn him away, an elderly woman who lived at the edge of the woods in a small, sagging house that smelled faintly of pine and smoke. She was said to be half-blind and older than anyone could remember, yet her mind was sharp as a blade. When he approached her porch one evening, she was already waiting, rocking slowly in her chair, her milky eyes turned toward him as though she'd known he was coming. Without being asked, she said, "You've been walking in their graves, haven't you?" Her name was Ada May, and her family had lived in Leflore County for generations. When he mentioned the Belrose ledger and the strange symbols he had found, she let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Those weren't just symbols, child," she said. "That was blood claiming itself." She invited him inside, where the air felt heavy with the scent of herbs and thyme. On the mantel above her fireplace hung a single photograph, faded and cracked, but even in its decay, he could make out the resemblance. The eyes, the sharp jawline, the eerie calm that mirrored the portrait he had found at the plantation. She caught him staring and nodded slowly. "You see it, don't you?" she said. "I am what they made. The last of the woodborn." She told him the story in fragments, her voice trembling between pride and sorrow. Her grandmother had been born on the plantation, a child of the master's son and an enslaved woman. When the fire consumed the estate, a handful of survivors fled into the woods, carrying infants that bore the Belrose name without permission to speak it. Those children grew up hidden, living in the margins of the town that feared them, their features betraying a lineage no one dared acknowledge. "They wanted us to vanish," Ada May whispered, her hand gripping his. "But you can't erase what shares your face." As the night deepened, she leaned closer and said that the land itself would not rest until every descendant of that bloodline was known. Her final words chilled him more than the wind creeping through the cracks. The Belrose name didn't die. It just learned to hide. When he left her cabin, the woods seemed to breathe again, as if they too had been listening to her confession. It was Ada May's story that led the stranger deeper into the forest, farther than he had ever gone before. She had spoken of a place where the trees grew closer together, their roots tangled over what she called the unmarked garden. She told him he would know it when he heard the silence, a silence too deep for birds or wind. 2 days later, under a grey sky heavy with the scent of rain, he followed a barely visible path that wound between the oaks and cypress until the ground beneath his boots turned soft and spongy. The deeper he went, the darker it became, as if the sunlight refused to touch that soil. The air felt heavy, like breathing through water, and even the sound of his footsteps seemed to vanish as he moved forward. Then, through the haze, he saw the stones. They were small, uneven, and half swallowed by the earth, arranged in crooked rows that stretched into the shadows. At first, he thought it was an old family cemetery, forgotten by time, but when he brushed away the moss from one of the markers, his blood ran cold. The name carved into the stone was *Belrose Star. He moved to the next, then the next, and found the same name again and again. Dozens of them. Some county initials, others first names paired with the same cursed surname, as though every soul buried there had been claimed by the same bloodline. The dates overlapped, children and parents, generations compressed into the same span of years. What chilled him most were the smaller stones, the ones with no names at all, only numbers, like a record kept by someone who didn't think the dead deserved more. In the center of the graveyard stood a larger monument, a slab of blackened stone that had cracked down the middle. The inscription had nearly faded, but he could still make out a few words carved in precise, deliberate letters. Asterisk for those who bore the name without the choice. Asterisk beneath it, the ground was disturbed, as if something had been recently unearthed or buried again. The stranger knelt, running his fingers over the dirt, and felt something hard beneath the surface, a piece of porcelain, smooth and cold. He pulled it free and realized it was a fragment of a child's doll, its painted face chipped away. The rain began to fall, soft at first, then harder, drumming against the stones like 100 quiet hands. As he turned to leave, he felt an odd pull, a presence that seemed to linger just behind him. The air trembled with a faint hum, and for the briefest moment, he thought he heard voices rising from the earth, whispering the same name carved into every stone, Belrose. Back in town, the stranger began to piece together the fragments of the past, trying to separate what was rumor from what was truth. He spent long hours in the small library behind the church, poring over brittle newspapers, baptismal records, and letters that hadn't been read in more than a century. Most of what he found had been carefully erased or rewritten, but small details kept surfacing, names crossed out, dates altered, and sudden disappearances noted with vague phrases like family relocated or property reclaimed. The pattern was unmistakable. Everything connected to the Belrose estate in 1843 had been deliberately obscured. But then he found a faded report written by a Union officer years after the Civil War, mentioning the night of the revolt and the massacre that left no survivors. That document became the missing key. The revolt, it seemed, had begun inside the plantation itself. The enslaved had risen against their masters not for freedom in the usual sense, but for vengeance. The records spoke of children stolen from their mothers, of women locked in the upper rooms and forced to bear the family's blood. When the truth spread among the workers, something in them snapped. They waited until the night of Midsummer, June 23, 1843, when a storm rolled through the county and lightning split the sky over Belrose. That was when the revolt began. The fire consumed the mansion from within, spreading faster than the rain could quench it. But what struck the stranger most was that no bodies were ever found. The flames had left bones, ashes, and the scent of burned cotton, but the Belrose family simply vanished. The local stories that survived described the night as cursed. Some said the master and his sons were dragged into the woods by the very people they had enslaved. Others claimed the fire didn't kill them, that they ran into the forest and were never seen again, swallowed by the land that had witnessed their cruelty. A single surviving letter, written by a preacher weeks after the fire, spoke cryptically of a pact sealed in blood and the roots that drank what the fire could not cleanse. Reading that line, the stranger felt a shiver creep through him. He realized that the graveyard he had found wasn't the end of the story, it was the beginning. If the family had disappeared, where had they gone? Why had the name Belrose continued to appear in records decades after the fire? He began to suspect that the revolt had not erased the bloodline at all. It had only scattered it, hiding it among the very people the family once claimed to own, binding master and slave forever in the same cursed lineage that refused to die. That night, the stranger decided to spend one final evening inside the ruins of the Belrose mansion. He told himself it was to find answers, to see if anything within those walls could confirm the story he now pieced together, but deep down, he knew it was something else, a pull he couldn't explain, as if the land itself demanded his presence. The sky was low and colorless when he arrived. The air felt thick, the kind of silence that carries weight, and every sound he made seemed swallowed by the emptiness around him. He set up his lantern in what had once been the parlor, the flame flickering against the peeling wallpaper that still carried faint traces of gold. The air smelled of soot and damp wood, the ghost of the fire that had devoured the house. For hours, nothing happened. He walked from room to room, writing notes, tracing carvings on the walls, and taking photographs of symbols etched into the beams, markings he now recognized as the same that had appeared in the ledger. When the wind began to rise, he heard the faint groan of the house shifting under its own decay. Then, from somewhere below, came a sound that didn't belong. It was soft at first, a low thudding rhythm, like footsteps muffled by earth. He froze, his light trembling in his hand. The sound came again, closer now, beneath the very floor he stood on. It wasn't footsteps. It was crying. He knelt and pressed his ear to the warped wood. The noise became clearer, small voices, overlapping, whispering something in unison. He couldn't make out the words until one name broke through the static of their murmurs. Thomas. The name repeated again and again, in tones that rose and fell like the tide. His chest tightened. Thomas Belrose, the patriarch, the man whose signature had filled every page of the ledger. The name he had been reading, writing, and speaking for days now echoed from beneath him as though the ground itself was remembering. Driven by some mix of fear and fascination, he pulled a crowbar from his bag and began prying up the floorboards. The wood splintered easily, revealing a cavity filled with damp soil and something else, remnants of fabric, small bones, and the faint glint of metal shackles rusted into the earth. The smell that rose from the opening was thick and sour, like something long buried that had begun to breathe again. The whispers grew louder, until the sound filled the room, pressing against his skull. He staggered back, choking on the air, his lantern flickering wildly. Just before it went out, he saw movement in the dark beneath the floor, something shifting, reaching upward, as though the house itself was exhaling the past it had been forced to keep. When dawn finally broke over the ruins, the stranger stumbled from the mansion pale and trembling, the ledger clutched to his chest like a shield. He didn't remember falling asleep, but when he opened his eyes, the sun was already bleeding through the trees, casting thin light over the ash-colored walls. He packed his things quickly, his hands shaking, desperate to leave the woods behind. Yet as he stepped past the crumbling gate, something strange caught his attention, a group of figures standing at the edge of the clearing, watching him in silence. They weren't ghosts. They were townspeople. A woman, 2 men, and a child, their faces solemn, their eyes fixed on him with an expression he couldn't name. When they stepped forward into the light, he felt the breath catch in his throat. Their faces, their eyes, the sharp curve of their cheekbones, all were unmistakably familiar. They bore the same features as the faces in the portrait he had found. He tried to speak, to ask who they were, but the woman only smiled faintly and said, "You've seen what you were meant to see." Her voice was calm, but her gaze carried centuries of silence. The man beside her stepped closer, his hands stained with soil, and said, "The blood never left these woods. It just learned to live quietly." The child stood between them, clutching a rusted locket that swung from her neck, engraved with the letters *T, the initials made his skin crawl. He understood then what Ada May had meant. The family hadn't disappeared. They had become part of the town itself, their lineage hidden in plain sight, their descendants carrying the same cursed legacy in their veins. As they turned to leave, the stranger noticed something else, an old scar along the man's jaw, shaped almost perfectly like a burn mark. His memory flashed back to the revolt, the fire, and the stories of those who had escaped it. It wasn't just bloodlines that had survived, it was guilt, passed down through generations. He wanted to call out, to ask why they stayed, why they hadn't left the land that had damned them, but the words refused to come. The child looked back once, her expression eerily serene, and whispered something he barely caught. It sounded like a warning, or perhaps a curse. When he finally returned to town, he looked at the people differently. Every face seemed too familiar, every smile carrying a shadow of the same bone structure, the same haunted eyes. In the reflection of a store window, he caught sight of himself and froze. For a moment, in the morning light, his face looked like theirs.